All right, all good. Thank you.
All right. Ready? Okay, great. Well, thanks. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight to learn a little bit more about the state of independent media and media in general in Connecticut. Publisher, what that means in the media business is the business side of the organization. So I'm essentially the CEO role here. So I report to the board, and then everybody else ultimately kind of reports up to me. The two main people that report to me are our executive editor, and she's in charge of all of the day-to-day coverage decisions. She and I work together to kind of formulate long-term coverage strategy, but I'm not involved in any day-to-day editorial decisions. And the other person who's critical for us is our revenue person who raises money mostly from individuals, anywhere from $5 a month to six-figure gifts. And part of my role then is to raise all of the other revenue, grants, advertising, and oversee the major giving and editorial processes. Some of you may know of us because you've seen our byline in the Day of New London. The Day is one of 12 daily newspapers in the state that actually licenses our content. And they basically use us as a capital news bureau, if you will. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But the things I want to focus on, here's a little bit of an agenda. Oops, got to advance this. There we go. So the topics I want to focus on tonight is, why is journalism even important? There's been a lot of hand-wringing lately about the decline of local journalism. Let's talk a little bit about why that's important. We'll talk about the Connecticut media landscape, what other media still exists or are thriving or doing well or not doing as well in Connecticut. We'll talk about the emergence of local digital news, digital meaning online only. We are a local digital news organization. And that whole kind of segment of the media world really is only about 12 or 13 years old. We'll talk a little bit about why that emergence occurred. Then I'd like to talk a few minutes about the Connecticut Mirror specifically. And then a couple of slides, we'll talk about the future of journalism to the degree that one can even predict the future of something that's been changing so rapidly recently and that's likely to continue to change rapidly. So, why is journalism important? I would argue that journalism is important for two reasons. Well, most broadly, it's critical to a thriving democracy. And that's true for two reasons. One, journalism is necessary to hold government accountable to the people who elect that government. As you may have heard, there is one profession that is included in the US Constitution, and that profession is journalism in the First Amendment, in the guarantee of freedom of the press. And that's because the founders understood that somebody has to be watching the cookie jar to make sure that hands aren't inappropriately going into the cookie jar. The second reason I think journalism is critical to a thriving democracy is because of what I call democracy literacy. Being informed about the democracy in which you live for three main reasons. One, so from a voting and elections perspective, there's data that shows, research that shows that their voter participation is directly correlated with amount of news available in a given community. So journalism is important to drive voter participation. Journalism obviously is important to help people decide who they want to vote for when they go to the voting booth. It's also important, kind of backing up from that, when you're first registering to vote, journalism helps you decide what party to register with, or whether you don't register with a party at all. The second broad category of why journalism is important within kind of this democracy literacy theme is advocacy. Journalism helps people understand and learn about a whole wide range of issues that they could potentially become involved with as an advocate in ways large and small. Journalism might help you decide what specific advocacy organization you want to join, volunteer with, testify on behalf of, or donate money to. And then the third element of democracy literacy that drives the importance of journalism is engagement. Journalism helps you talk to your kids or your grandkids about what issues are topical, are important to you, that you think might be important to them. So it stimulates, journalism is a catalyst for discussion. It's a catalyst for teaching your children or your friends, for that matter, about issues that are important. It's important for helping you engage in discussion with your elected officials, your mayor, your congressperson, your state rep, your state senator, your US senator, your governor. The last time I personally saw Ned Lamont was in fact in New London County at, what's that place called? Muddy Waters on Bank Street in New London. And then finally, journalism helps you just kind of communicate with people through social media, sharing of articles, and that stimulates conversation as well. So hopefully I've kind of made the case a little bit for why journalism is important. And so now we kind of juxtapose that against the fact that there has been this dramatic contraction of legacy traditional newspapers really since the birth of the internet in the mid-90s. Circulation in the US since the mid-90s has declined from 60 million to about 35 million today. So almost 50% decline in newspaper circulation in 25 years or so. 2,100 newspapers in this country, about 25% of the total, have closed since 2004. So just in the last 15 or 16 years. Remarkably, 200 counties in the US don't have a single newspaper, and half of US counties only have one newspaper. And you contrast that with counties in Connecticut. I mean, New London County has two major dailies that I know of, the Day and the Norwich Bulletin, lots of weeklies. Fairfield County has probably 6 or 7 daily newspapers and even more weeklies. So Connecticut isn't particularly a news desert, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but other parts of the country are, and Connecticut has its own issues related to contraction of newspapers. Most of the surviving newspapers, the other kind of 3/4 that haven't closed since 2004, have significantly reduced their coverage. They've cut employees. Newspaper newsroom jobs have shrunk by 50% since 2008. As we established, circulation has declined. So there's a major contraction in place. And just to dramatize this, here is a tweet from my son, proud papa, who is a reporter for the Hartford Courant. And he tweeted several months ago, I'm not sure people fully appreciate this. The Hartford Courant newsroom over time, in the 1990s, it had 400 people roughly. In 2018, when he started, there were around 85 people in the newsroom. In November 2019, when a hedge fund named Alden Capital first invested in the Courant, there were 72 people in the newsroom. And today, now that Alden Capital has fully acquired the Hartford Courant, there are 36 people in the newsroom. This tweet actually was from 3 or 4 months ago. I think that number is now down to 32 or so. So that begs the question, why did this gigantic contraction in the news business even occur? So the first is the emergence of the internet, and I'll take each of these kind of one by one, but just to kind of broadly summarize. The first is the emergence of the internet. The second is the advertising bloodbath that newspapers took, basically, eviscerating, demolishing most of their revenue streams. The third is the corporatization of journalism, and I just alluded to that a little bit by talking about the hedge fund's acquisition of the Hartford Courant. And then there is the erosion of trust that has been kind of well documented and that people talk a lot about. So first, there we go. The emergence of the internet. So remember when the internet first emerged in the mid-90s and people weren't quite sure what this thing was, and newspapers saw an opportunity to increase their visibility through this newfangled internet thing. And they offered their content for free with the expectation of, all right, we'll engage some people, they'll read the free content, they'll want more of it, and they'll then go pay for a written subscription. Well, it didn't really work out that way. People over time came to want to read their news on the internet, particularly if it meant that it was free and they didn't have to pay an ever-increasing subscription price. So subscription revenue at newspapers starts to plummet. In terms of the advertising bloodbath, so as you may know, classified ads were a huge revenue generator for newspapers, and they were the highest margin revenue generation vehicle in newspapers. So Craigslist comes along and, like, bye-bye classifieds. There's no more reason, there's no longer a need for classifieds. Craigslist, and now some of its followers, some of its imitators, have, kind of further, basically final nail in the coffin of the classified section of the newspaper. Google and Facebook also contributed to the advertising bloodbath, but in a different way. If you're a local business and you're trying to target a very specific type of customer or prospective customer, newspapers were okay. You could buy, at best, you could buy newspapers by zone. You could buy a newspaper that version of the day, for example, that would be targeted to a particular set of towns, another version of the day that would be targeted toward other towns. But Google and Facebook come along and they can basically serve up your ads only to people that you're specifically interested in. It could be, white males over 60 years old. It could be Black youth. It could be anything you wanted. It could be by where they live. It could be by religion. It could be by gender. It could be by education level. It could be by income level. And so that very precise targeting is really important to small businesses who don't have large advertising budgets. So small businesses kind of flocked to Google and Facebook, and as a result, they took their advertising budgets away from traditional newspapers. So the question becomes, well, why can't online advertising for news organizations make up for that lost revenue? The reason is there's just not as much perceived value in a digital ad as there used to be in a print ad. So this chart here shows the decline in advertising in print newspapers is pretty steep. And around 2003, you start to see little green shoots of advertising digitally, but it doesn't really climb at the rate that the decline in print advertising is taking place. So third, the corporatization. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just do this slide also. So Facebook and Google, if you look at advertisers, their national advertising budget, 58% of it goes to Google and Facebook. At the local journalism level, 77% of local advertising goes to Google and Facebook. So that just dramatizes, the issue with how Google and Facebook have really hurt traditional newspapers and have created a struggle even for digital news organizations like ours. I will say Google and Facebook are both mounting kind of these giant public relations mea culpa campaigns. And, they're offering chunks of money, but it's not a tremendous amount of money. We take it. because it's better than nothing, but it still doesn't necessarily represent the value of what we believe our content is worth. Okay, third reason, corporatization of journalism. Back in the old days, you know, your community newspaper, your daily newspaper was owned by somebody who was of the community, committed to the community, to the degree that there were newspaper chains. They were very focused on the importance of journalism in a thriving democracy. They were kind of committed at a values level to strengthening the communities they served. But they operated at very high profit margins. And as kind of the financialization of the US economy began in the 1980s, over time, investors turned to journalism and saw those large margins and started getting involved and thought they could make some money. And they started cutting costs and they started taking profits. And that has also contributed to the decline of the resources that are available to traditional newspapers. And then finally, the erosion of trust has, I believe, impacted the contraction of traditional newspapers. It's kind of a reflection of the current political climate in which we operate. There's also, you know, kind of concerns, politically driven or otherwise, about accuracy, about bias, about transparency. I'm happy to address some of that in the Q&A. A conversation of trust is probably an entire presentation on its own. So I'll just leave it at that the erosion of trust is also a factor in the shrinkage of traditional journalism. So that raises the question of the emergence of local digital news organizations. So in the last 5 or 6 years, about 700 online-only local news sites have sprung up to fill the void that's been left by this contraction in traditional newspapers. Some of those are for-profit, some of those are non-profit, like us. They happen to be disproportionately clustered in the big cities and the affluent areas where, especially in the nonprofit sector, philanthropy is more prevalent and can support some of those nonprofit news organizations. The rate of growth and the number of independent local news organizations has really been remarkable. It's been on fire over the last 5 years. The number of independent local news organizations has grown 50% over the last 5 years. So that's, you would think, great news. You know, this decline in local newspapers is being replaced by these more agile digital local news organizations. But it's not quite that simple, because 80% of those new local news organizations have fewer than 5 employees. So that 400-person Hartford Current newsroom of the mid-1990s is now being replaced, or at least, well, in Connecticut's case, Connecticut Mirror, we have 16 employees, but Connecticut News Junkie, which you may know of, only has a handful of full-time employees. So, and around the country, there are many daily newspapers replaced by, you know, 2 and 3 people news organizations. If you watched 60 Minutes last night, you may have seen a feature on local journalism in which a county in Pennsylvania is being served by 1 person. So there are 4 types of nonprofit news organizations. There are statewide nonprofits like us, like the Connecticut Mirror. Vermont Digger is another example up in Vermont. The granddaddy of them all is the Texas Tribune. That's the news organization, the statewide news organization we all aspire to someday. There's Cal Matters, there's MinPost. About half the states have a statewide nonprofit news organization. Then there are city-focused nonprofits. So the New Haven Independent, right here in our own backyard, is a great example of that. They were one of the first nonprofit news organizations to be founded in the early 2000s, maybe even late 1990s, by a guy named Paul Bass, who still is working 24/7 to run that place and keep it open. And they do great work covering the city of New Haven and environs. Then there are topic-specific news organizations. So You may be familiar with the Marshall Project, which focuses on criminal justice issues. There's something called Chartbeat or Hechinger Report. They focus on education issues. There are health nonprofits. There are environment, there are energy. There's a food production nonprofit that a friend of mine runs. So there are lots of topic-specific nonprofits. And then finally, there are investigative nonprofits, and probably the one that's best known in that category is ProPublica. So I mentioned the idea of a news desert before. News desert basically is one of these geographies, one of these counties, one of these regions that isn't served by any news organization. As I said before, Connecticut doesn't really have a news desert, or isn't a news desert. There's still 18 daily newspapers in the state of Connecticut, but there is news poverty in the sense that the contraction has left major coverage gaps. I alluded to us being the kind of state house or Capitol Bureau for the day. That's a coverage gap. The day, as the day has shrunk a little bit over the years, they don't have the political reporters in Hartford that they used to have, and we kind of fill that void for them. There's coverage gaps in local government coverage. I don't know the specifics on the day. I do know that other large newspapers in the state don't cover local town government nearly as thoroughly as they used to. There's no real coverage of the congressional delegation to speak of anymore. We're actually going to take a small step toward fixing that, hopefully in the next few months. There's very little explanatory, in-depth, long-form, investigative reporting going on to provide kind of context for the news that's happening all around us. And that's also an area that we're trying to fill. The local daily print newspapers and their online counterparts are pretty good at telling and reporting on the who, what, when, and where of news, and they don't necessarily have the resources to provide the how and the why of the news. So that's a void, and that's something that we think is important for us to focus on as a complement to the reporting that all of our friends in traditional newspapers provide. This slide here, I won't go through all of this, it basically just shows all of the different media that still actually do operate in Connecticut, just to reinforce this notion that Connecticut is not a news desert. So 17, 18 legacy daily newspapers, gotta fact check that. There's still a handful of radio stations that do news, but ever shrinking. 2 NPR radio networks that do local news, the TV stations, and others. So the founding of the Connecticut Mirror. The Mirror, there was a kitchen table, by the way. This is not that kitchen table, it's just representative. But there was a kitchen table around which the idea of the Connecticut Mirror was born. It was actually at home in Branford. And the story is that somebody who had been involved in policy was alarmed at this national contraction. And she was particularly alarmed when the Hartford Courant in 2009 announced a major layoff of many of its reporters, including a number of reporters in their Capitol press corps. And so she convened a number of people, including a reporter from the Courant who was laid off named Mark Pasniokis, to think through how they could create a digital news operation. And the idea was they would raise enough money to kind of mount a 3-year experiment. And the idea being, if it can't be somewhat self-sustaining and demonstrate a proof of concept in 3 years, then it probably wasn't worth doing. Well, that was in 2009. And obviously, from my perspective, the good news is we're still here. So the experiment worked. And in fact, we've grown considerably since then, as you might expect. Just to clarify one thing, however, I've been with the Mirror since 2017. So I was not around at the founding of the Mirror. I was not at this kitchen table. So the Mirror was founded to and the mission has evolved slightly. The words have evolved slightly, but the idea is basically the same. The mission was founded to inform Connecticut about public policy, to hold government accountable, and to amplify diverse voices and perspectives. The Mirror started with 4 people in 2010, first published in January of 2010, and a handful of beats: state budget, education, health, and politics. Today, we are a staff of 16 people. We had somebody brand new start today. And we have many more beats. We have the state budget. We still have health, and we still have education, politics, certainly elections, campaigns. We have an environment beat. We have a justice beat. We've done a lot of housing work. We hired our first ever economic development reporter last year. We formed and launched an investigative unit last year. And that's the group. You may have seen some of our coverage related to the current, I hate to say scandal because I don't want to be too overwrought about this, but shall we say potential corruption, or at least some head scratching events in Hartford related to school construction and the pier down in New London, construction of the pier. So we've driven a lot of that coverage through our investigative. The ways that we're different from daily newspapers, I alluded to one way a moment ago, but we tend to be longer form, more in-depth. We focus on the how and why of public policy. And I guess a big difference is because only about 10% of our revenue is from advertising, we don't have to do lots of smaller stories that maybe have a little bit more of a sensational bent to them, because we don't depend on how many people see a particular number of ads to generate our revenue. We have the luxury of being able to do that more in-depth work that maybe doesn't attract a huge, giant mass audience, but does attract an audience that is really concerned about public policy. So speaking of that audience, there was an old joke at the beginning of the Mirror that the Mirror's audience was 06106. Now, that happens to be the zip code of the state capital. So the idea being that the only people that were really reading the Connecticut Mirror were elected officials and legislators and their staffs and lobbyists. And, to some degree, maybe that was true at the very beginning. But now our audience is much, much broader. We have readers throughout the state. And we have actually a very active readership in New London County. So our audience is becoming much more of a broader, more general market kind of audience. From a budget perspective, when I started in 2017, we were roughly $1 million organization. We're now a $2.2 million organization. So we've had some nice growth over the last several years. We are a nonprofit. Nonprofit status, basically the only difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit is, one, whatever money we raise goes right back into the journalism. We don't have to pay shareholders. We don't have to pay them dividends. We don't have to worry about quarterly earnings for Wall Street. And the other major difference is, as nonprofits, we can accept foundation grants, although some foundations are actually beginning to provide some level of funding for for-profit news organizations, kind of in recognition of the importance of journalism to strengthening their communities. And revenue, so I just talked about revenue, roughly $2.2 million. I mentioned that about 10% of our revenue comes from advertising. Half of it, 52%, comes from individuals. Like I said before, anywhere from the $5 a month person to the handful of six-figure donors that we have each year. About a third of our revenue comes from foundations. About 3% comes from licensing our content to The Day and to 11 other daily newspapers in the state. And then a couple of percentage points of other miscellaneous forms of revenue. So other ways that we're different is when the legislature is in session, as it is now, we focus largely on what's going on in the legislature. Almost, not quite, but almost like a paper of record of the legislative session. And the other newspapers in the state don't really have the capability anymore to do that. We're also different in that we stay in our lane. We don't have sports, we don't have weather, no film reviews. We get calls constantly about coming to a ribbon cutting or coming to a press conference related to, the opening of a new community center. So we just don't do those kinds of things unless there is an opportunity to use an event like that as kind of an illustration in a broader story about public policy. Sandy Hook is kind of an interesting example. When Sandy Hook occurred, and that was early in our life cycle. That was 2012. We were founded in 2010. One of the reporters said to the editor, "Hey, one of us needs to get down to Sandy Hook and cover this breaking news." And the editor said, "No, we are not going to Sandy Hook to cover the breaking news. There are hundreds of media people that are covering the breaking news, but you can go down to Sandy Hook to start thinking about what's called the day two story. It's the stories that news organizations begin to write after the breaking news part is over. And we're trying to understand, why did this happen? How did this happen? And provide context. And of course, the day two stories are still going on, 9 years later, as recently as last week with the Remington decision. And Remington, albeit bankrupt, Remington's insurers being liable for violating Connecticut fair consumer protection laws. Other ways we're different, we have a opinion section that is really statewide. All of the newspapers in the state, the opinion section is targeted mostly toward local communities. Ours is statewide. We've created a community editorial board, which is 12 people from all parts of the state, including somebody from Mystic, I believe, that publish opinion pieces 4 or 5 times a year from us, reflecting some of the needs and opportunities in their local communities as related to public policy. And finally, when we did some research a few years ago, 58% of respondents indicated that if the Connecticut Mirror were to go away, it would be a shame because we provide coverage that we, meaning the respondent, can't get anywhere else. So, little commercial for the Connecticut Mirror. As I mentioned before, we recently hired an economic development reporter. That's another point of difference. It's probably our newest point of difference. The economic development reporter is not a business reporter. A business reporter would report on earnings and corporate C-suite moves and small companies moving in, moving out, what real estate they're acquiring, et cetera, et cetera. An economic development reporter, to our way of thinking, is focused on broader trends in the economy and the impact of economic development strategy by the state. Reports on industry cluster formation and performance. So down in your part of the state, obviously defense is a huge cluster. And in fact, our economic development reporter is going to be doing some work down in your part of the state, focusing on workforce development in the defense industry. And this reporter will focus on the components of a strong economy: transportation, infrastructure, business climate, labor relations. And we've raised $300,000 for 3 years for this economic development reporter. So we know we have her on for at least 2.5 more years, and we're now, going back out to try to raise even more money to ensure that she can stay on longer. I mentioned before that we're trying to fix our Washington situation. We are collaborating with Connecticut Public Radio to jointly fund and hire and manage a Washington reporter who will focus on the impact of federal policy in Connecticut. And the defense industry in southeastern Connecticut, obviously a major recipient of federal funding. And so I imagine that reporter will spend some time focusing on the defense industry in your part of the state as well. We just started creating topic-specific newsletters. So if you are already a subscriber to the Connecticut Mirror, you may only get our daily summary of news headlines. We also are starting to produce monthly newsletters about very specific topics. Our first one was called Injustice, and not surprisingly, it focuses on justice issues once a month, written by our Justice Report. We're developing a couple of new podcast concepts that we will be introducing in the next couple of months. We are hoping to create a dedicated data team. We have one data reporter position now. We hope to add a second, because in this day and age, there's lots of stories to be found in data, and there's opportunity for data to kind of support reporting in stories. And then finally, one opportunity maybe a little bit longer down the road for us is to do for some of the larger cities in Connecticut what we're doing for the state, meaning focus on local policy for some of a report on local policy for some of the larger cities, the way we report on state policy at the state level. Almost done here. So, a potential vision of ours going forward is, we call it the ProPublica of Connecticut. That's a little too investigative oriented, but really more the idea of kind of a long form, in-depth, contextual, explanatory arm of the Connecticut Mirror. And then simultaneously, this state government paper of record concept that I described earlier. Right now, we kind of largely do the concept on the left when the legislature is not in session, and we do the concept on the right when the legislature is in session. And over time, we hope to be able to do both of those things 12 months a year. And in terms of the future of journalism, I'll just say this. We talked about journalism as being critical to a thriving democracy. We've talked about the fact that the market has failed journalism. Remember the corporatization and the advertising bloodbath. So therefore, by definition, journalism is what is called a public good, an entity, a service in a community that's important for the cohesiveness and the integrity and the strength of that community. Like arts institutions, we all understand that arts institutions depend largely on philanthropic support in order to survive. The environmental movement, for example, a lot of the environmental advocacy that occurs is occurring through nonprofit organizations that are funded by donations. Same with hospitals, same with basic research in government. That's not philanthropy, that's government money. That's not something we're looking for the market to do. That's something that government is asked to do. Even public radio is a public good. Public radio, Connecticut Public Broadcasting, about 10% of their revenue, about $2 million, is funded by taxpayers. So those are all public goods, and public goods basically are driven by the fact that it's up to all of us, we, the community, for their support. We, the community, support public goods because they're important to our communities, and I would argue that it's up to all of us as a community to support nonprofit digital journalism, just as we support other critical community institutions. And that is it. If you have any questions, I'll take some questions now. If you have questions after we get off, feel free to email me at publisher@ctmirror.org. And I will now stop sharing. There we go.
Bruce, thank you so much. This is a really great overview. You touched on a lot of topics, and we do have a couple questions already in the chat, but I want to say too, once I get through these, if you have questions, folks, if you want to unmute and just ask yourself, that's good. We have a pretty small group. Anne asks, why did you become a journalist?
Well, Anne, I'm actually not a journalist. There's kind of a it's kind of a long story here. Um, my last journalism experience was when I worked in radio news in college at a local news station. And I loved journalism, veered away from it for reasons I won't get into, always regretted it. So from 2000 to 2016, I was a consultant, a solo consultant focusing on nonprofits. And the board of the Connecticut Mirror determined they didn't really need a journalist running the business side of this nonprofit. They needed somebody who understood nonprofits running the nonprofit. So I'm not a journalist, but what attracted me to journalism, and by the way, our staff reminds me constantly that I'm not a journalist. You don't know what you're talking about. That's a crazy idea. You're not a journalist. And I always say to them, correct. That's why the board hired me. I'm not like stuck in the same old ruts that maybe traditional journalists might be stuck in, as innovation is kind of the watchword of journalism today. But what attracted me to journalism back in college, the reason I always regretted not pursuing it and why I did ultimately jump at the opportunity to come back, is really for all the reasons I said. I just think it's such a critical pillar of our democracy. I always enjoyed communication. I always enjoyed what was going on before other people knew what was going on. So lots of reasons, some significant, some not quite as significant.
And then, John, I'm going to read what you wrote off, but if you wanted to add to it, I see that you turned your camera on, but John has said, thank you for doing this. I teach media at Eastern Connecticut State University, asking for advice for students about preparing for work in this new environment, critical skill sets for flexibility in seeking work or keeping a job, importance of internships or practical experience above just homework for classes. Thank you again.
I mean, I guess to me, well, I guess I would say this, within journalism, there are several different career paths. So there's reporters. We're actually looking for what is called an audience person, an audience specialist, somebody who isn't a reporter per se, but is interested in journalism, understands journalism, and does analysis of what the audience responds well to, what they don't respond well to, helps write headlines that will be found on searches. And I'll say something more about that in a moment. Who can produce newsletters. So the audience person we're looking for would take over the newsletter production piece, which is largely just working with the reporters. It's not reporting themselves. There's social media roles where it helps to, so social media has really two components to it. One is it's just kind of a way of sharing our content, but social media can also be a content platform all its own. There is potential to create content specifically for social media that you wouldn't necessarily create for the basic website. And one example of that is, we've been talking internally about doing kind of a 5-minute TikTok video wrap up of the legislature in any given week. So that's not something we would put on our site, but it's something that you kind of need to understand journalism, you need to understand policy, but you don't have to go out and necessarily be a reporter. For the reporters in your classes, you obviously know what the basic skills are. I would just say, it's a question of attitude. It's just the people who really, really want to go make sure those guys with their hands in the cookie jar are getting caught, gosh darn it. That's what's going to make people successful. And I think, I don't know, if I had any advice to give to a young aspiring journalist, it would be, depending on what I guess it's more a policy role, but I would say, if you don't have that driving sense of curiosity or commitment to government accountability, then maybe this type of journalism isn't for you. Now, there are a lot of young people are talking these days about advocacy journalism. And, that gets back to the whole idea of trust and bias. And, we lost somebody really great in the hiring process last year from a, really strong graduate program who said, I want to do advocacy journalism. I want to go, write for a justice-oriented news organization that has a point of view and that shares that point of view. And, the issue with that, of course, is that really journalism anymore? Or is it just kind of preaching to the choir, as opposed to kind of trying to engage people across the political spectrum and across all ideological persuasions and help them understand other perspectives, which I think is what's so critical in a democracy. The point I put a pin in a moment ago is, and I said this during the formal part of the presentation, so we don't write stories or write headlines on our stories to chase page views. We cover the stories we think are important to cover, but once the story is published, then we are pretty aggressive about trying to generate page views for something we've already written, right? So the distinction being, we don't decide what to write based on what the number of page views will be. We write first and then we chase the page views. And the relationship of that to search is that, there are two different headlines in every story. One is the headline we put on the story that you can see at the top of the page. And the other is the headline that you would see in your search display results. And those headlines are based on what are called search terms or keywords. And so we will write a headline for the search part that shows up in Google search results that's maybe a little bit more crafted around trying to be found by people searching on Google or Bing or Yahoo or whatever. But that doesn't affect the headline that goes on the story itself.
Okay, and then another question is, what specifically can individuals and local communities do to support local newspapers and reporters to be sure that they thrive? Thanks, Cindy.
Well, as you said at the beginning, try it on for size, see if you like it. If you do like it, if you do like the Mirror or your local. I'm sorry, was the question about local legacy newspapers or local news in general?
It says local newspapers and reporters.
Well, so, I guess the answer is actually the same. So subscribe, whether it's the Day or it's the Connecticut Mirror. There is no subscription fee for the Mirror. We are free, but you can subscribe to our newsletter for free. But find some way to provide some level of financial support if you're so inclined. Share stories that we publish with your friends and relatives through social media. Engage with us, attend our events, write opinion pieces, download the podcast. Send emails of moral support. You guys are doing a great job. Our people love that, like anybody. What a lot of donors and foundations are obviously somewhat impressed by are readership numbers, level of engagement. The other thing that community members can do is if there's a story in your community that you think, especially if it has kind of broader statewide policy implications, call us or email our tip line, tips@ctmirror.org, and let us know if if there's a great story idea out there. And I guess the final thing I would say is avoid the trap of disparaging the media, right? The media, as far as I'm concerned, is a term that was invented to create an enemy. And the media is this amorphous, vague, over there thing for many people, oftentimes just the media that doesn't reflect their perspective. And the local media are different. People trust their local media more than they trust national media. Many people know the reporters who work in the local media. So no more talking about the media because that's very misleading. All right, wait, we have another chat comment. Oh, there. Back?
Yeah, sorry. Knock
no
at the door as we're closing up. Okay, I'm just checking the chat to be sure I didn't miss anything.
I think that was it. Just good luck.
Yes.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. I have a quick question, and I know this is not going to be something that you could like just rattle off here. I'm wondering if you have favorite, or maybe favorite's a weird word, but some long form stories or some investigative reporting that you think the Mirror has done in the past couple of years that you feel like are some of the best that you've put out there. I know you did a series on like housing. I think you referenced it. I think that was with ProPublica, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a really impressive, and it details these segregation issues and affordable housing issues in the state. And I wanted to know if there were others like that, because I'd like to kind of link them into a follow-up email to everyone.
Sure. Yeah, so on our site, there's a tab. Well, so if you go to the upper left of the site, there's a burger bun. You know what a burger bun is? The three lines. It's called a burger bun. You click on the burger bun. It shows all of the different beats. If you click on investigations, you'll get an investigations landing page. So you'll see our housing stuff there. You'll see we did a long form series on inclusive economic growth a couple of years ago. We did a really, I think, seminal definitive series on wealth inequality in Connecticut in 2018. That's still highly, highly relevant. And then I'll give you a commercial for two series that we have coming up that you may want to keep your eye out for. One is on cash bail reform and the impact that cash bail is having on lower socioeconomic members of our communities. And not just in the short run, like rippling through their entire lives. And why is the bail business been so able to resist reform in Connecticut for so many years when reform is occurring in other states? And then the second series that we have coming up is a series on aging in Connecticut, on elder care, on changes in, the shift from nursing care to home care, for example, and the lack of regulation in home care, and the disparities that exist throughout people's lives that also exist in different forms in the context of elder care. So those two series are coming out. And then there's actually the third one I referenced about some work on workforce development in southeastern Connecticut. That one's probably a little bit farther down the road, but sometime this year.
Thank you. Does anybody else have last questions or? Again, thank you, Bruce. This is really a great service for the community in so many levels. And I'll throw out there too, I actually, before I went to get my master's in librarianship, I was torn between journalism route or the librarianship route. I think we have a lot of invested interests in common. And I had reached out to you long before the pandemic. So we've been trying to make this happen for like 2 years now. So thank you for making it to our Zoom.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, and
Thank you.
good luck.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you all for making it as well. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Ari.
Thanks, Anne.
Take care. Keep the
Thanks,
faith.
Sean.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks. Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Up the good work. Yes.
All right, take care all. Have a good night.
All right. Good night.